Hi, everyone. I'm excited to chat with Scott King today. He is a middle grade fiction author, a thriller author, a nonfiction author, and the host of the amazing The Creators Cast podcast, which is super helpful for anyone who's creative. And Scott is also a screenwriter with his MFA in film from American University. And he's also a board game photographer, which is super cool. So this is so fun to chat with you today, Scott.
What up? I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Would you share your story and what inspired you to do all these things, like to write, to be a screenwriter, to be a board game photographer, to write novels and be an indie author?
I think for me personally, it's just at the core of who I am. Like if I were to self-identify myself, I would say I'm a storyteller, right? That's
Yeah.
that's what I do is I want to make stories. I want to share those stories out there. It's not important to me how I do that, whether that's through a graphic novel, whether that's through film, through a novel, even through photography. As long as I am creating in some way, I'm content. So I think my career has kind of evolved to match that. Um, I originally had planned, okay, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to do the educational route. I'm going to possibly get into teaching because I like teaching. I'm very big into empowering people to write and be better writers and just finding confidence in their own voice. And then on the side, I will pursue the screenwriting thing. But my father got really sick when I was in high school, and he stayed sick into my 20s. And I decided, well, you know what? I'm going to give up the whole LA thing. And instead of going to LA, I'm going to stay on the East Coast. I'm going to do the graphic novels and the comics.
Mm.
And that was pretty good. And it was awesome. It was fun. But then like it's very hard work, partially because it's a collaborative medium in the same way that film is, except that most of the work really falls on the artist. And an artist might take a year to 2 years to 3 years to draw a single book. And that's really slow in today's market. And from there, that kind of evolved into, well, what am I going to do now? And I was like, I know, I'm going to go ahead and try the novel thing. And that's kind of how the novel thing happened. In terms of the photography and the podcasting, my wife is a chemical engineer, and she used to work at a plant in Delaware. It shut down, and the options were, well, we either moved to Texas or we moved to Michigan, and we kind of ended up in Texas.
Oh,
At the
okay.
time, I was teaching at a four university, and when we moved here, there just was no school that had a tenure track plan. And I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And she's like, well, do whatever you want to do. I was like, all right, I'm going to take photos of board games. And so I became a board game photographer and decided to do that and then do the writing thing. And that's my gig now.
That's awesome. Would you share just a little bit about? I'm just
Mhm.
so curious about board game photography. So, what's the process with that? I'm just as a creative, just I'm so curious about that.
So technically, I guess I'm a commercial photographer. And what that means is that a publisher, a client, hires me to shoot a product.
Yeah.
In this case, it's board games. They mail me the board games, and because board games are, I guess, malleable in a sense. They're not in a set state. It's not like I have an iPhone and I take a photo of an iPhone to make it pretty. A board game's got dozens, sometimes even hundreds of components. So I have to learn the rules. I have to make sure I feel confident playing the game and know how the game works. I need to kind of know what's the cool thing about this game versus any other game. What's special about this game. And once I know those things, I just take the photos and I do my pretty artsy photos, which might be like a pretty enough to go on a wall or a desktop wallpaper. And I do like the standard photos that are on white. So they go on Amazon, other gaming stores like Miniature Market, Cool Stuff Inc. Publishers print them out, use them for booths at conventions or on sell sheets when trying to sell to other markets. And that's just pretty much how it works.
We every year we buy like one or two board games. So this is something
What,
I'm always searching for new board games.
what was the last game you bought?
Uh, well, okay, that one's it's probably a few years old, but my kid my college age children have gotten into what is it? Settlers of Catan. That's what it
Oh
is.
yeah, it's a classic game, and a lot of gamers say that's the game that really brought them into gaming altogether. So that's a very popular, well-known one.
Is that right? Oh
Hmm.
wow. Huh. So I didn't know. Well, I like it that there's so many different offshoots of it. You can do the pirates. You can do the. It's kind of fun. I don't know, but I mean, we have the regulars like Monopoly and but
Yeah.
that's just something
Hmm.
we do every Christmas. It's like a tradition. So I just think that's cool that that's what you do. So since you're also a screenwriter who has taught screenwriting at the college level as well as a novelist, would you share some tips about screenwriting and maybe how that relates to novel writing? Because they are related, right?
I would say that storytelling in general is what it is, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time you're dealing with a character, they want something, there's conflict because something's stopping them, and that's just the core of what a story is. So whether you're talking about a novel or a comic or a TV show or a movie, all that's going to be the same. What I think really separates screenwriting is that when you're writing a screenplay, you're not talking about a finished product. A screenplay is a blueprint for a movie.
Okay.
And keep in mind that movies are a collaborative medium, so it's not just one person. There's often hundreds of people making movies, and bits of pieces of all those people come together to make the movie.
Yeah.
Whereas with the novel, you're talking about generally one person, and that one person writes this thing, and that thing is generally a finished product. It goes out to the public, and people read it. And so, in terms of a writing standpoint, screenplays are very much about structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the Hollywood traditional structure. It's a 3-act structure. This generally happens on page, 1. This happens on page 10. This is the midpoint, the end of Act 2, the rock bottom for the character, the climax, and all that stuff. And it's pretty rigid. You can break those things. You can change and shift them up. But Hollywood generally wants that structure just because that's what we've been taught to watch since the medium was invented in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And what's nice about that structure is you can steal that structure and apply it to your novel, and you can break it and change it into whatever else you want to it. And you're allowed to. It's not going to upset people. It's okay. But if you are going to write a screenplay, just realize that generally in screenwriting, it's structure first. And the flip side of that, I guess, would be is that with novels, especially the indie market, it's almost like genre is first. Reader expectation is probably one of the biggest things you need to consider when you're going to write a novel. And not in the sense that you should write to market or not write to market, but just know that if you're going to write a market or you're going to write a book and there's dragons in it, and then at the end of the book, spaceships show up, if that's not properly set up or properly dealt with, you're going to have the expectation of the readers really, really disappointed because a lot of fantasy readers don't want to read sci-fi. So just know what you're getting into when you're writing and make sure it's all there from the start.
Yeah, you obviously know writing inside and out. So your recent nonfiction book called The 5-Day Novel, which is fantastic, by the way. You talk about how you wrote a novel, obviously in 5 days, because that's the title, and which sounds incredible. So would you kind of share your motivation or your inspiration behind that?
I've been wanting to write a fantasy series for a while now. And last year I sat down and was like, all right, I'm going to do book 1. And I wrote book 1 of the fantasy series, and it took 6 months, which honestly speaking isn't a long time because the book is 110,000 words. There's 6 points of view. There's world building. They're setting up future books. They're setting up side stories. It's just a lot. So 6 months is actually a really good time for something like that. But in the indie scene right now, it's all about writing faster and people are bragging how fast they can write and all this machismo and all that kind of stuff. I felt really stupid, like, oh my gosh, I suck. Why does it take me 6 months to write this book? Ugh. And then I was at a meetup in early last June. And one of the women was saying, oh, yeah, I had this writer friend. She's crazy. She just wrote, a whole 50,000 word novel in one day, sent it to her editor, and then 2 days later it was published. And I was like, what the poop? How is that possible? So that led to a kind of slippery slope of researching romance, because I don't write romance, but researching the authors and the genre and how hard they have to work because romance readers are very voracious.
Yeah.
And so to be a hot, consistent author in romance, you just have to write fast. That's just what the market is right now. And I found that impressive. I think romance authors do what they do. It's astounding because I can't do it. But last summer I was like, well, maybe I could do it. Should I try to do it? And it kept nagging on me for 6 weeks. It was like, I think I'm going to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. I think I'm going to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. And finally I decided, you know what? I'm going to see if I can write 50,000 words in one day. But that didn't mean that much because for my writing process, there's pre-writing, there's writing the first draft, there's rewriting, and then there's kind of like the polish before I send it off to my editor. And I wanted to make sure I had all those things done so that I could really publish the book that I wrote, and that there was a sense of accountability for it, right? So if I were to try and write in a first draft or 50,000 words in one day and didn't publish it, well, it probably meant that the book wasn't worth publishing anyway. So it's kind of like meh. And that's kind of how the 5-day novel came about, because I said, all right, the challenge is I have 5 days, and over these 5 days, I will do the pre-writing, the first draft, the revisions, and the polish, and it's all going to happen in those 5 days, nothing ahead of time and nothing after. And that's just how it was born.
Wow, that is super cool. I love that. That's so inspiring. So I went through your book twice because I found it so fascinating. But so in your book, obviously you start with day zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of getting into the mental state, which is, that is something that I've struggled with, and a lot of people that I've talked to, like, online or whatever, people that I connect with, that's what they struggle with, is the mindset part of writing, and and resistance, just in many different ways, right? So, you talk about a few important takeaways that writers should ask themselves as they, prep for their writing days, probably daily. And, so they're, like why they're writing the novel, or how to move beyond the lack of confidence and fear, and how to be persistent and committed. So, would you talk about each of these takeaways, and how, like, first time writers, how that would be helpful for them?
Sure, and let me talk a little bit about the origin of how the day zero came about to begin with.
Okay.
Um, Obviously, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've been trying to work very hard on just getting to know a lot more indie authors, and I kept hearing a lot of the things come up. I go to a meetup, and these kind of topics would come up, and someone was very frustrated because they didn't know what they were doing with this book or why this book. They just thought at first, I'm going to write this story because it's going to sell, and that's it. And there was no emotional connection to the characters or the story. Yeah. Or they were feeling really frustrated because they could only write, 1,200 words a day. And by that count, if they were doing the math, it was going to take them a full month to write a book. And, their life was over. So the day zero section of the 5-day novel is really about kind of my response to seeing how other authors were reacting to what's happening right now just in the industry. So one of the first topics I talk about in the book is to know why you're writing what you want to write. And then I think it's important, and it's important for multiple reasons, but it's also important to keep in mind that no matter what your reason is for writing, it's a right reason. Yeah. I am not a fan of writing to market. I don't teach writing to market, but guess what? If you want to write for a market, there's nothing wrong with that. If you do it right, it can be financially beneficial. So there's lots of good reasons to write. I talk about in the book why I want to write. My dad was sick growing up. In many ways, books were kind of my escape for that. So a lot of what I do in writing is trying to give back what was given to me. Yeah. At the same time, I'm a creator. I'm a storyteller. I have these things just kind of bubbling in my head. And the only way to get them out is to get them on the page so I can just kind of go on to the next thing. If not, I just get like stir crazy. My wife, Lisa, she notices if I'm in between projects because I get antsy around the house. I'm kind of just grumpy or fidgety, and then I'm not complete because I have these things just going on and they're not pouring out. And knowing why you're writing is important because it informs the thing you're writing. If I know that giving back and character and theme are very important to me, then I'm going to make sure I spend more time on that when I sit down to actually write the book. If you're writing to market and you know that the finance and the business is more important to you, then that's going to inform the writing. You're going to make decisions based on that. So one of the first things you should do is know why you're writing the thing you're writing. Yeah. I think the next topic, hold on, I did save this list, I promise. The next thing you wanted me to talk about here. Okay, so confidence, yes. Probably one of the biggest things I even saw as a professor in classroom is that novice writers lack confidence. And I think a big part of that is that people new to writing don't realize how hard writing is. You don't sit down, even a professional doesn't sit down, write the first draft and it's beautiful and it's done and walk away, it's over. Yeah. Writing is hard work. Yeah. And the first draft is going to suck. And you can't kick yourself for having the first draft that sucks because that's just how it works. Especially if it's the first time you've ever written a novel. It's going to be bad. Just embrace the bad. That's okay. The only way to become a better writer is to write.
Yeah.
And if you let fear get in the way of writing, you're never going to get better. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And yeah, fear is hard to work with, but the only way to get over it is just to suck it up and do it, because that's it. That's the only answer.
Yeah.
Touching back a little bit to character wants, I think it's important to realize that when you're writing a story, the character wants drive the story, right?
Yeah.
Well, the same thing goes for the author.
Yeah.
Why is the author writing? Well, you defined the answer why. But then the next question is, how bad do they want that thing? How bad does an author really want to finish the book they're working on?
Yeah.
If they really want it, if they are stubborn and they're going to make it a priority in their life, they're going to finish it. If they don't really want it, if they just kind of talk about it but don't follow through, then clearly writing isn't that important to them.
Yeah.
So if you're the kind of person who is struggling in life, you can't make writing a priority, then obviously writing isn't a priority to you. And it's sad. And if you want it to be a priority, you got to make time for it. I think the largest piece of advice I always hear people say is, oh, well, I get up an hour early. So instead of getting up at 6, I get up at 5, and I write from 5 to 6 every day, and that's my schedule. And that works for a lot of people. Some people's schedules, though, are too filled. I wake up every day at 4, normally about 4:50-ish, and I'm booked for the entire day. I can't get up at 3:50 and then write for an hour. My brain would die. I'm already getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep, which is functional for me, but any less and I can't do it. Yeah. So to make sure that I have the time for writing, I have to give up other things. There's days where I have to say, okay, you know what? I want to play the new Mass Effect game that just came out. I still have games that came out last fall, like Final Fantasy, the new one. I haven't played it. I have it. It's on my Xbox. I haven't touched it. Why? Because creating right now is more important. I have to have that a priority. Yeah. So if you're struggling to fit writing into your day, you have to realize that you either fit it in or you kind of give it up, because if writing matters, you're going to make it matter.
Yeah. How can writers, does this just happen naturally, that how writers can become aware of their author voice? Does that just happen as you continue to write?
Yes and no. Author voice, let's define what that is real quick for those who might not know. When you're talking about a novel, there's generally two voices. There's the character voices, and characters all have their different kinds of voices. This character sounds different from that character because of their life experience and those kind of things. And then there's the author voice, and the author voice is kind of your fingerprint on the book that you wrote. And an example of this would be that, I have middle grade stuff, I have the nonfiction stuff, I have political thrillers coming out in a few weeks, I have a dystopian thriller, I have the fantasy book. So, I'm a dirty genre hopper. But no matter which one of my books you read, they're still going to feel like a Scott King book. Yeah. And, my background is screenwriting. And as a result, it means my prose isn't overly flowery. It's pretty clean and to the point. Yeah. My POVs they're a little bit into the head, so you still get what the characters are thinking, but they aren't really, really deep. And little things like that, the way I structure stories, the way I pace stories, the way I handle dialogues, the humor, no matter which genre I write, it's going to show up. So someone could read any one of those books and be like, yeah, it's definitely a Scott book. If you're thinking on a larger scale, think of someone awesome like Neil Gaiman. Doesn't matter what Neil Gaiman book you pick up, it's going to feel like a Neil Gaiman book. It doesn't matter what Stephen King book you feel like, it's going to feel like a Stephen King book. That's what author voice is. Now, finding your author voice isn't easy. I know professional, published traditional authors who are 8 books into the career and they still couldn't say what their voice is, or indie authors who are 5 books in and they might not know. Yeah. It just kind of happens when it happens for you, but it doesn't mean you can't be aware of it. Probably the best thing you can do to become more aware of your author voice is to read. Don't just read your genre, read other genres. Don't just read contemporary, read old stuff. Yeah. Before I decided to write the dystopian thriller, I said, all right, you know what? I'm going to go back and read all the old dystopian thrillers that I didn't read. And then I'm going to also reread the ones I know. So I read We, which is a Russian dystopian, often considered one of the very first ones. Oh, okay. It's what 1984 was actually based off of.
I I haven't read that one. I should. I love
Mhm.
dystopian. It's one of my favorites.
Well, even this is actually a good example for my author voice. I'm remembering off the top of my head, so I don't know. I think We came out in 1924 Russia, and then George Orwell wrote a review of it, and then like 20 years later he wrote 1984, and structurally it's almost exactly the same as same plot, same characters, same setup. But because George Orwell was a poet, because he grew up in a totally different culture and society, because his voice was different, We feels drastically different from 1984, even though it's almost plot is exactly the same. And that has to do with author voice. The author voices were different. And so one of the things you can do to embrace your author voice is to do just that. Realize, like, you know what? It doesn't matter whether I'm too close to this or too close to that. This is the kind of story I like. This is what I enjoy. This is what I am good at. Embrace those things. Read a lot and just embrace who you are as a creator.
Yeah. That's super helpful. That's good. I think sometimes, like I know for myself, sometimes like you're sometimes afraid to really embrace who you really are, right? Because for example, I have like 6 chapters written of a dystopian, but it's just sitting there, right? And I still have all the ideas. In fact, I had already figured out the trilogy and the like what do you call that? Like a trilogy of a prequel, like a pre, because then it all kind of came to me and I wrote it all down, but then I just left it. So, are there tips on how someone can get past this stuckness? Are there tips to, like, do you just dive back into the research part of it and see what inspires you? Is that sort of,
That's a hard one for me because I'm a very focused person. I know that,
yeah,
okay, I'm gonna decide this book is my next book, and then that kind of consumes me. Like I have trouble thinking about other stuff because
yeah,
that one idea is just what my brain is focused on. For what you're talking about, my guess is that there's something about this dystopian that either you're scared of or
yeah,
you're not excited about, and you probably have to figure out what those things are. If
yeah.
there's something that is really scaring you, and maybe it's just confidence, then guess what? Suck it up and just go ahead and write it because
That's
you
good.
know
I need
that's
to hear
that
that.
is what
That's
it is.
good. Yeah,
If there's something that it's not exciting about it, then figure out what that is and make it exciting. What is it that you like about dystopians in general? Why do you want to write a dystopian? What is it about the genre that you love and enjoy? Find those things and re-excite yourself about it, and then dive in and do it.
yeah. No, that's really good. And that might be helpful for whoever's listening who feels stuck. Like, because I think there's more authors than just me that have stuff sitting on their computer, right?
Hmm. No, I
So,
mean, I have a little piece of computer paper folded, and it's got a list of book titles on it. And I have a thumbtack put on the wall, and these are the next probably 10 books I'm going to write. I don't know what order I'm going to pick them at. I just know that those are going to be the next. So, for example, I just wrote The Dystopian, which happens to be on the top. The next one after that is another nonfiction book. But I thought I was going to write that 2 books from now. But I've already started. I'm almost finished it. So it's kind of pick the story or whatever book that you are really feeling the most passion towards and make that your next project.
yeah,
Because at that point, then you don't have to worry about the excitement. You're already excited about it.
yeah. Well, that's super helpful, Scott. That's great. So kind of moving on with the 5 day
Hmm.
novel. So, you mentioned that you kind of did, you in the book you talk about day 1, day 2, day 3. And so day 1 was kind of the brainstorming because you said you just kind of took each day and because you wanted to do start to finish, right? So
Right.
would you just take us through your strategy for each day, how you managed to get the book done in 5 days, which is so amazing.
I don't remember off the top of my head what the original plan was because I got off schedule. Spoiler, I screwed up in planning my 5 day novel. But I specifically obviously remember how I did it and what the end product was. So the plan was always to have day 1 be the pre-writing. And that was coming up with the initial concept, the story, the character arc, the structure, everything I need to know to be able to write the novel. And in this case, I don't normally judge whether someone's a pantser or an outliner or whatever, but I definitely think if you're going to write a novel on such a tight schedule, you have to have an outline. You have to have a plan. So one of the biggest things I had to do during the pre-writing after figuring out all the characters and all that kind of stuff is a scene by scene breakdown of what the book's going to be. So this scene happens here, and in this scene, this is the whatever character reveal or character growth, and then this is the main conflict of that chapter or scene. And I had to make sure I had that roadmap before I wrote the book, because if not, I would get to a spot and I would just kind of freeze or not know what to take with it. So that was probably the most important thing about day one. And I kind of wrapped day one early, and I probably should have started writing the book on day one. But you got to remember that one of my main drives for doing this was to see if I could write 50,000 words in one day. So even though I had hours to spare on day one, I called it quits and decided, no, I'm not going to start writing till day two. And if you're doing a 5-day novel, I recommend you don't do that. I recommend you do start writing it on day one.
Yeah.
So day two came about, and day two was just all about trying to hit 50,000 words and getting through that first draft of the story. And I didn't. I was shy of 30,000. And it was like very frustrating, and I felt stupid. I was like, oh, I am horrible. I suck. This is the worst thing ever. Oh, this is just bad. And I didn't want to do it anymore. But accountability happens, and I had posted online that I was going to attempt to do this thing. And so when I woke up on day three, instead of just calling quits and giving up, I was like, all right, fine. I'm going to do this thing because people know about it now. Ugh. And so day three was really all about finishing the first draft. And I think my first draft was 36 or 38,000 words. And that's okay for me because I'm an underwriter. There's lots of times if I have an action scene, I might say, person A beats up person B. Awesome fight. And then I'll go back and that becomes like, 1,000 words.
Oh,
So
okay.
So my first draft was definitely much more on the skimpy side, whereas the final book is just under 50,000 words. And with the backup story that I include for email list enticement, that pushes it over 50K. So day three was just all finishing up the first draft. Day four was then the rewriting. Because I have those places where I do things like skip fight scenes, rewriting is always a little bit more work for me because I have to fix those things that I kind of glazed over. And I also think that as a writer, rewriting is important because your first draft, you're getting to know your story. You're getting to know the characters. And I think in many cases, an author doesn't know what their book is until they finish that first draft, because you really do find the story. And when you finish that first draft and go back, the way you hear the characters in your head is even different, because you'll go back and look at the very first scene you wrote and you're like, oh, well, so-and-so wouldn't say it this way. I don't know why I wrote that the first time. It would be slightly different, same exact meaning, but you would word it differently because by that point, you've now developed the character's voice and you know who they are. So I think rewriting is really important, and it lets you fix and tweak and make all those changes. So day four was all rewriting. Day five, I believe I just wrapped up the rewriting, and then I did the polish. And the polish is just basically all the self-editing junk that I hate doing, but it saves me money when it comes to editing, so I do it. And for those who don't know, a polish is often referred to like a line edit. And that means you're going line by line throughout the whole book, reading it mostly aloud and deciding, okay, is this a concise word? Is this meaning exactly what I want it to mean? So it's much more about the prose and the flavor than it is about just copy editing. In fact, I generally suck at commas. I don't really work with commas at all. So if I think a comma is supposed to be somewhere, or maybe a sentence is running too fast, I'll add commas. And if it's in the wrong spot or it doesn't work, my editor will deal with that later. Yeah. But really for me in the polish, it's all about just getting the feel of the prose and making sure it means what I want it to mean. Yeah. And once I hit that point on day five, I sent it and I didn't touch it again. It went to the editor and came back.
Yeah. That's great. And that's a good way. I was just thinking of how you do the first draft, where you'll often just put in stuff. I think that's got me caught in the past because I'm always thinking, well, I need to have all the details down right now. But actually, I could just put in brackets research, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because then it doesn't stop what the movie that's playing in your head, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's definitely a different part of your brain when you're writing. And when you get in the flow, the zone, whatever you want to call it, you're just kind of cranking out. You're in the scene, you hear the voices, you smell the stuff. And when you get to those parts, it freezes you, it stops you, and it just pulls you out, and it's really hard to get back in. And so that's why I make those little cheats, is because I want to keep in the flow. I want to keep on moving forward, and I'll let that other side of my brain fix it when I get to,
Later
the
on.
actual rewriting part. Hmm.
I need to do that better. That's one of my that's one of my things where I get stuck. Yeah. So how do people know when their story is really done? Is it like, do you just have all your ideas on the draft that makes sense to the story? Obviously, not all your ideas, but the ideas that make sense to the story. Like, is that how you tell that the story is done, or?
So I have my podcast, The Creators Cast, and I've interviewed dozens of authors, and that's one of my go-to questions is asking them. And from what they've said and from my own experience, I don't think there is an answer. There is no set rule. There's
Yeah.
nothing. It really depends on you as the creator and what your workflow is. I know a lot of authors who don't bother with the polish. They get to that rewriting stage, they are happy with the rewrite, and they just turn it into their editor, and that's it. So maybe that person's final stage isn't the same as my stage, and that's okay because writing is what works best for you and best for your process.
Yeah.
And then that's what you have to decide at that point is decide what it is you want from this story,
Yeah.
what you were trying to tell with that story, and once you feel you've achieved it, then you're done.
Okay. Yeah. So kind of along with that question, like how do you, like, do you write a list, for example, of like the holes that you see? So for instance, by the time you get, like you were saying, by the time you get to the end of your first draft and you start to say, oh, that's really kind of the theme that I was going with, and this is what this character is like. So once you know that, after you've finished the first draft, do you go back and then make a list like, oh, okay, so this is what I have to look for in each scene, or what do you do?
For me, I generally do have a list.
Yeah.
It depends where I am in the process. When I finish my first draft, I normally know that there's a bunch of bold sections. So one of the things is I pull out where those bold sections are. I make sure my list is in chronological order. So when I'm rewriting, I'll get to that point where they go, okay, in this scene, I need to fix this, and that scene, I need to fix that. So in the book I just wrote, the dystopian thriller, when I first started it off, I hadn't realized the book was going to have 2 points of view. Honestly, it was just supposed to be like a 6,000 word short story, and now it's like a 40,000 word novella. So the first like 5 chapters need to be restructured to have that second point of view woven in and have it just flow in a much more organic way. And so when I was busting out the list, it was, chapter 1, introduce character X, chapter 2, character X's point of view, and then blah 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 blah. So for me, it's definitely more about taking whatever is broken that I know are the holes in the plot, whether I know the holes in the character arc or stuff just doesn't make sense, and just making that giant list for me. And part of the process with rewriting is that list may not be complete. You may go ahead and do your rewrite and then discover, oh, well, all these things are fixed. And now that these things are fixed, I realize that the real problem is over here, that character wasn't as defined as it should be. And so the readers aren't really getting why this person is doing this thing that they are doing.
Yeah.
So rewriting is an organic process, and you might go out of order. One of the things I do a lot of times is I'll do a rewrite pass just looking at one specific thing. So when the book gets far enough along, even like this last one, again, the dystopian, I'm just talking about this just because I just finished it and just got it back from my editor. When I got it back, I decided, okay, I'm going to do a read through, and I'm only going to read through the second person POV lines and just make sure that they're all in the proper voice. And then I went and said, okay, that all works. Now I'm going to go back and I want to check the descriptions of the first person POV, because I want the POVs to be noticing and seeing different things, because as people, we notice different things. I have a very sensitive nose. So one of the first things I notice when I walk into a room is how things smell. It's a weird thing of mine. I'm guessing that you don't walk into a room and immediately notice things smell unless they are just strong.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of how, our own perspective works in the world. So when I went back, I did a pass just making sure the POVs were noticing and seeing different things. One character was much more into color and clothing and that kind of stuff, whereas someone else was much into architecture and smell and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just structuring your rewrite however works best for you, and patching and going along and building until you have a finished book.
Yeah. It helps to hear your process,
Mm.
because you have great ideas there. And so that's awesome. So, just kind of as we finish off, what is the best piece of writing advice that you have been given or wish you'd been given, and how did that inspire you?
When I was in grad school, I met Brad Meltzer. He's a political thriller
Oh
author.
yes, wow.
Um, it was a weird thing where he was going to have a book signing at Politics and Prose in Washington D.C. and I was only a few blocks from American University, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to go meet Brad Meltzer. And so I emailed his post and said, hey, you want to set up an interview for me? And I don't know why they did. And so we got to hang out. I got to meet him, ask him tons of stuff. And at the time, I wasn't doing the novel thing. I was still coming off the screenwriting and then doing the comics thing. So he and I talked a lot about comics and what it was like working for DC and that kind of stuff. And afterwards, he invited me to his book opening, which was really cool. But probably the most important thing he said to me is that if you want to be a writer, then write.
Yeah.
And that's really what it all boils down to. And that definitely has become my philosophy. Like, I wish I could claim that quote, but he's definitely the one who said to me. And I think it's really important that if you want to be a writer, then write.
Yeah.
That's all it has to be. You have to make it a priority. And then once it's a priority, you have to actually do it.
Yeah.
And then once you do, you're a writer.
Yeah.
It's so simple, and yet it's so hard to actually do and achieve.
Yeah. That's great. And how fascinating. Yeah, that's so great. Well, would you share about new books or projects? I mean, you mentioned a little bit that you have on the go right now, and then also where readers and writers can find your books, your podcast, and your photography online.
Sure. I do want to set up that we've been talking a lot about the 5-day novel.
Yes.
And I want to say that I'm very upfront about it. In the introduction, I say that writing a novel in 5 days is crazy. Most people should not write a 5-day novel. I definitely am not saying buy my book and then write a novel in 5 days. What I'm trying to do with a 5-day novel is saying, hey, I wrote a novel in 5 days. This is kind of how I did it. Take the things that I did, fit them into your own workflow, and use that to write your novel at a faster pace if possible, but at least get your novel done.
Yeah.
So I just want to be clear that I'm not telling everyone to go out and, hey, give up what you're doing for a week and only write a book. That's not it at all. That's not realistic. But you can take some of the things I do, and they might help you write faster or at least finish.
Yeah.
As for what I'm working on, I just wrapped a dystopian thriller. It's called Resist Them, and it should be out sometime mid-May. It's now at the copy editor, but then I have to send it to my ARC readers and then plan all the marketing crap. Currently, I am just finishing up the follow-up to the 5-day novel. I'm going to call it Story Pitch. So this is an exclusive. I have not officially announced it, but it has a very beautiful cover. Actually, I might be able to show you guys the cover since this is video. Ooh, this is exciting. Awesome. This is so exciting. I've showed people at like meetups and so forth. Like I was in Austin last weekend and then I'm going to be at a writing conference in like 2 weeks. So I've showed a few special people the cover, but let's see here. Oh, can we get it?
Oh, it looks so great. Yeah, I see it. That's awesome.
So I'm wrapping that up now. I'm hoping to get that to my editor probably within like a week and a half or so. And then I'm not sure when it's going to come out. It might come out June or July. As for me, you can find me on my website, www.scottking.info. I am at Scott King on Twitter. And then anything else, whether it's the podcast, photography, or all that kind of stuff, it's both those places, Twitter and my website.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Scott, for taking the time and for just sharing your insights on, writing and screenwriting and, just your inspiration for, first time writers. It's awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, we were still live, right?
Yeah.
I do want to say that when you emailed me and you said, hey, will you come on my podcast? My normal go-to response for that is, hey, is there going to be coffee? And I've done this as a test because if you've read the 5-day novel, I'm a fan of coffee.
Yeah.
I go to a local coffee shop and write. And this is the first time I've ever gotten this response. You emailed me back and said, hey, there's not going to be coffee, but guess what? Even though I live in Canada, I will send you a bag of my most favorite blend so you can have it. Well, I found the blend on Amazon, and that's what I've been drinking this whole interview. So I just want your listeners to know that you recommended the Three Sisters blend of coffee. I can't remember. What's the name brand name?
Oh yeah, it's
Kicking Horse.
yeah, Kicking Horse. Yeah.
Kicking Horse, yeah. Okay, so Three Sisters Kicking Horse. It is a fantastic coffee. I am very happy with it. It's kind of a medium roast with like a light acidity, and it's got a lot of flavor. So I just thank you for sending me coffee, and I did drink it during this whole interview. I swear.
Oh, that's awesome.
Hmm.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's actually it's actually named after like where we live near Canmore, and there's mountains that are called Three Sisters. So anyway,
Oh, so that's where the name. That makes sense then.
yeah.
So
So
this was fun, and thank you for the coffee recommendation. It's fantastic.
oh, awesome. Thank you, Scott.